The wind on the high plains did not just blow. It scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of broken mesas and dried creek beds, peeling the paint from wagon wheels and the hope from men's souls. Here, in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, the land was a ledger kept in red dirt and gray sagebrush. It tallied every drop of water and every hour of daylight, and it charged a high price for mistakes. Elias Thorne knew the cost better than most. At 39 years of age, Elias was a man carved from the same hard timber as the fence posts he drove into the rocky soil. He was tall, with shoulders broadened by 20 years of wrestling cattle and stacking hay, but he walked with the slight, stiff hitch of a man who had been thrown from a horse one too many times. His face was weathered, lines etched deep around eyes the color of slate, eyes that watched the horizon with a habitual, quiet vigilance. He rode the southern perimeter of his property, a stretch of land that bordered the Badlands where the earth cracked open into useless gullies. It was late October, 1887. The air already held the metallic tang of coming snow. Elias pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher. He lived a life of strict routines, a fortress built against the chaos of grief. Since Martha had passed 6 years ago, taken by a fever that burned through her in 3 days, Elias had become a man of silence. The town of Jericho Creek, 10 miles north, called him decent but cold. They said he was a man who paid his debts on the day they were due but never stayed for a drink. They were right. He checked the barbed wire, wearing thick leather gloves. The fence was new, a jagged silver line cutting through the wild grass. He tested the tension of the top strand. It sang a high, tight note in the wind. Then his horse, a roan gelding named Banjo, shied violently to the left. Elias steadied the animal with a firm hand and looked down into the wash. At first, he thought it was a calf, perhaps a stray from the vain herd that had wandered and died of thirst. The shape was huddled, half buried in a drift of dead tumbleweeds. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he descended the slope, the shape resolved into colors that did not belong to the earth. The faded blue of calico and the stark, terrible white of skin exposed to the sun. It was a woman. Elias stopped, his breath catching in a throat unused to surprise. She lay on her side, one arm thrown out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and along the hem, the fabric stiff with dust and darker stains that looked like dried blood. Her hair, loose and matted with burrs, obscured her face. He knelt beside her, removing a glove to check for a pulse at her neck. Her skin was cold, frighteningly so, but there was a faint, thready beat beneath his fingers. She let out a low moan, a sound of pure distress that seemed to vibrate in the dry air. Elias looked at her wrists. They were bruised, dark purple marks circling the delicate bones. He looked at the tear in her dress, the way her boots were scuffed through the leather at the toes. This was not an accident. A fall from a horse did not leave marks like hands. He felt a surge of cold anger, a sensation he had suppressed for years. He carefully worked his arms underneath her. She was light, dangerously so, as if the wind had already carried away the best parts of her. When he lifted her, her head lolled back, and he saw a face that might have been pretty once, now swollen along the jawline, lips cracked and bleeding. He carried her up the slope, his boots slipping in the scree, holding her close to his chest to shield her from the biting wind. He did not know who she was. He did not know what trouble she brought with her. He only knew that leaving her here was a death sentence, and Elias Thorne, for all his coldness, was not a murderer. He managed to get her onto the saddle, mounting behind her and holding her upright with one arm wrapped around her waist. The ride back to the ranch house was slow. The wind howled, drowning out the sound of the horse's hooves, but it could not drown out the shallow, ragged breathing of the woman against his chest. The ranch house was a sturdy structure of pine logs and chinking, built to withstand blizzards and isolation. Inside, it was clean, ordered, and silent. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leather. Elias carried the woman into the main room and laid her on the settee near the cast iron stove. He added wood to the fire, building it up until the iron ticked with heat. Then he fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He hesitated. He was a man who lived alone. The propriety of the situation gnawed at him, the voice of the town whispering in his ear, but looking at the grime in her wounds. He pushed the thought away. He dipped the cloth and began to clean her face. He moved with a rough gentleness, the same way he tended to a hurt foal. He wiped away the blood from her lip, the dirt from her forehead. She shifted, her eyes flying open. They were wide, dark, and terrified. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough fabric of the settee, her legs kicking out weakly. She gasped, her hands flying up to cover her face, as if expecting a blow. "Easy," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly. He held his hands up, palms open. "You are safe. You are at the Thorn Ranch." The woman stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, scanning the door, the window, the rifle on the mantel, and finally, back to him. She looked like a trapped animal, vibrating with the instinct to run even though her legs could barely hold her. "I have no money," she rasped. Her voice was broken, dry as the dust outside. "If you want payment, I have nothing." Elias felt a crack in his composure. He lowered his hands slowly. "I do not want your money. Miss, I found you in the wash near the south section. You were half dead." She flinched when he took a step toward the water bucket. "Don't," she whispered. "I am getting you water," Elias said firmly. He dipped a tin cup into the bucket and set it on the small table beside her, then retreated to the other side of the room, leaning against the heavy oak table. "Drink, slowly." She watched him, her eyes tracking his every movement. She reached for the cup with a trembling hand, drinking greedily, spilling water down her chin. She choked, coughed, and drank again. "Who did this to you?" Elias asked. The question made her freeze. The cup clattered to the table. She curled in on herself, pulling her torn skirt down to cover her boots. "I fell," she said, the lie so thin it was transparent. "I was traveling. I fell." "You fell and bruised your wrists?" Elias asked quietly. She looked away, staring into the fire. "I came from town," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't go back. Please, I need to rest for an hour. Then I will go." "You will not go anywhere tonight," Elias said. "There is a storm coming off the peaks, and you cannot walk 10 yards, let alone 10 miles to the next settlement." She looked at him then, and he saw a profound, ancient exhaustion in her face. She was young, perhaps 25 or 26, but her eyes looked 100 years old. "I can't stay here," she said. "It isn't right. A woman like me, in a house like this." "It is a house," Elias said. "And you are a human being who needs help. That is all the right I need." He saw the disbelief in her face. She had been trained, he realized, to expect the worst from men. She expected a price. "I will prepare the bunkhouse," Elias said, pointing toward the door. "It has a stove and a cot. It is warm. You will sleep there. I will stay here. You can lock the door from the inside." He saw her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. The offer of a lock seemed to mean more to her than the offer of food. Jericho Creek was a town that prided itself on order. It had a church with a bell that had been hauled all the way from St. Louis, a bank with a heavy iron safe, and a social hierarchy as rigid as the strata of rock in the canyon walls. It was ruled by a trinity of power. There was Silas Vane, the cattle baron whose herds grazed on half the county, Reverend Caldwell, a man who preached fire on Sunday and counted tithes on Monday, and Marshall Coburn, a lawman who believed that peace was best kept by keeping certain people quiet. To Jericho Creek, order meant everyone knowing their place. Men worked and provided. Women were virtuous and silent. Anything that fell outside those lines was a threat to the moral health of the community. Rumors in Jericho Creek traveled faster than a telegraph wire. For 3 days, the woman, who gave her name only as Lydia, stayed in the bunkhouse. Elias kept his word. He brought her food, stew with chunks of beef, biscuits with honey, strong coffee. He would knock on the door, wait for her to unlatch it, and set the tray on the crate just inside. He saw the way she watched him. She watched his hands specifically. She seemed waiting for them to turn into fists or grasping claws. On the second evening, the wind died down, leaving a silence that rang in the ears. Elias sat on the porch of the main house, mending a bridle. Lydia came out of the bunkhouse, wrapped in one of his old wool blankets. She stood by the railing, looking out at the darkening plain. "You have a lot of land," she said. Elias looked up. "Enough to keep me busy. It is quiet here. I like the quiet." She hesitated, then stepped closer to the warmth of the stove he had dragged onto the porch to heat water for laundry. She watched him work the leather. "You hold your hands near the fire," she observed softly, "before you pick up the tools. You warm them first." Elias paused. He hadn't realized anyone noticed that. "Old breaks," he said. "The cold gets into the knuckles." "My father had that," she said, the words slipping out before she could catch them. She clamped her mouth shut, as if she had revealed a state secret. Elias did not press her. Instead, he noticed something about her. "You eat the bread first," he said, "and you hide a piece in your pocket every time I bring a tray." Lydia stiffened, her hand going instinctively to her apron pocket. Her face flushed with shame. I'm sorry. I will put it back." "Keep it," Elias said, keeping his eyes on the bridle. "I am just saying, there is plenty of flour in the larder. You do not need to hoard it." "You will not go hungry here." She stared at him, her eyes searching for the trick. Men did not give without taking. That was the law of the world she knew. But Elias simply went back to stitching the leather, his head bowed, asking for nothing. It was a small thing, but the air between them shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a cessation of immediate hostilities. The secret could not last. On the fourth day, a peddler named Tobias rattled his wagon up the long drive to the Thorn Ranch. Tobias was a man with a wandering eye and a loose tongue, selling pots, pans, and news from the wider world. Elias was out in the pasture. Lydia, feeling stronger, had ventured out to the well to draw water. She wore a dress Elias had found in a trunk of Martha's old things, a simple gray cotton that was slightly too big for her. Tobias pulled his mules to a halt. He looked at Lydia, standing by the well, the wind whipping the gray dress around her legs. He squinted, a slow, gap-toothed smile spreading across his face. "Well now," Tobias said, leaning down, "if it ain't the little bird from the red slipper, I heard you flew the coop. Darling, folks in town are mighty curious about where you landed." Lydia dropped the bucket. It clanged against the stones. She backed away, her face draining of color. "I don't know you." "Oh, everyone knows everyone." Tobias chuckled. "Does Elias know what kind of stray he's taken in? Does he know the trouble that follows a skirt like yours?" Elias rode up then, banjo moving fast. He put the horse between the wagon and the woman. His face was hard. "State your business." "Tobias," Elias said, his hand resting near his hip. "Just selling wares." "Elias, just selling wares," Tobias said, holding up his hands. "And seeing the sights. Didn't know you had company. Didn't know you were the type to entertain the working girls." "Get off my land," Elias said. The tone was not a shout. It was a door slamming shut. Tobias flicked the reins. I'm going. Just be careful. Elias, you know how the Reverend feels about sin in the camp." The wagon rattled away, but the damage was done. The dust from his wheels drifted back like a curse. The visit from the authority figure came 2 days later. Marshal Coburn did not come with a posse. He came alone, riding a tall black mare, wearing a badge that caught the sun. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that hid his thoughts. Elias met him at the gate. He did not invite him down. "Morning, Elias," Coburn said, tipping his hat. "Marshal, good weather for fencing." "It holds." Coburn shifted in his saddle. "Elias, I will get straight to it. There is talk in town. Talk that you are harboring a woman out here, a woman named Lydia." "I have a housekeeper," Elias said calmly. "She needed work. I needed help." Coburn chuckled. A dry sound. "A housekeeper? Is that what we are calling it? Elias, look, You are a good man. You keep your nose clean. But this woman, she is bad news. She was involved in an incident at the Red Slipper. There are accusations. Theft. Immorality. Is there a warrant? Elias asked. Not yet, Coburn said, his voice dropping an octave. But Silas Vane is asking questions, and the Reverend is talking about the sanctity of our community. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. Send her on. Elias, put her on a stagecoach to Denver. Get her out of here before the mud splashes on you. She is not well enough to travel, Elias said, and I do not turn people out to the wolves. Coburn's eyes narrowed. She is not people, Elias. She is a ruin, and if you keep her here, you are telling the town that you stand with her kind against decent folks. Think on it. Coburn turned his horse and rode away. Inside the bunkhouse, Lydia had been standing by the window, pressed against the wall so she could not be seen. She had heard every word. She is a ruin. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. She knew how the story ended. She had seen it happen to other girls. First the whispers, then the stones, then the fire. She could not let that happen to the man who had given her a blanket and asked for nothing. That night, the moon was a sliver of ice in the sky. The wind had picked up again, howling around the eaves of the house. Lydia packed her few belongings, a comb, a handkerchief, the extra biscuit she had saved, into a small bundle. She took off the shoes Elias had lent her, not wanting to make a sound on the floorboards. She would walk barefoot until she was clear of the ranch yard. She opened the bunkhouse door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She shivered, pulling the shawl tight, and stepped out into the dark dirt. She made it to the main gate before a shadow detached itself from the porch of the main house. "Going somewhere?" Lydia gasped. Spinning around, Elias stood there, a lantern in his hand. He was not holding a weapon, just the light. "I have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard the marshal. They will come for you. Elias, they will destroy you for keeping me." "Let them come," Elias said. He did not move to grab her. He simply stood in the path, a solid block of resistance against the wind and her fear. "You don't understand," Lydia cried, the panic rising in her chest. "You don't know what they do. They will ruin your name. They will burn your fences. They will hurt you just to get to me." "I am not afraid of Silas Vane or the Reverend," Elias said. "And I am not afraid of a town that thinks cruelty is a virtue." "Why?" she demanded, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Why are you doing this? I am nothing to you. I am just a stray you found in a ditch." "You don't owe me this." She stepped closer, her bare feet numb in the cold dirt, her desperation breaking through the walls she had built. "Please stop doing that forbidden thing," she cried, her voice cracking with the weight of it. Elias looked at her, confused for a moment. "What forbidden thing?" "Treating me like I am human," she shouted, the words tearing out of her throat. "Protecting me, feeding me, looking at me without seeing dirt. It is forbidden. Don't you know that? It is a sin to them. Please just stop. Let me go. Let me disappear like I am supposed to." The wind howled between them, carrying her words away into the vast darkness. Elias set the lantern on the fence post. He walked up to her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough to block the wind. "I cannot do that," he said. His voice was steady, anchoring the night. "I lived my life worrying about what was proper. Lydia. I buried my wife, and I followed the rules, and I lived in a cold, empty house, because that is what a decent man does. But I will not look at a woman who has been beaten and starved and tell her she is worth less than my reputation." He looked her in the eye. "It is not forbidden to be kind. If they hate me for it, then let them hate me. But you are not leaving this ranch to die in the cold. Not tonight, not ever, unless it is your choice to go to a better life." Lydia stared at him. For the first time in years, the terrifying calculation in her head stopped. She looked at this man, this weathered, stubborn, quiet rancher, and saw a wall that would not crumble. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a sobbing relief that shook her entire frame. Elias knelt beside her. He picked up her bundle. "Come inside," he said. "The coffee is still hot." The next morning, the war began. When Elias rode into Jericho Creek to buy flour and nails, the mood had shifted. The silence was not the respectful quiet he was used to. It was heavy and sharp. He walked into Holloway's general store. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, was at the counter. When she saw Elias, she gathered her skirts and moved to the far side of the aisle, turning her back to him with a deliberate sniff of disdain. "Mister." Holloway served him, but he did not make eye contact. He weighed the nails in silence. "That will be all. Elias?" Holloway asked, his voice tight. "That is all." Elias walked out. As he untied Banjo from the rail, a man named Deke, one of Vane's riders, walked by. Deke paused, looked at Elias, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, inches from Elias's boot. "Got a new pet, I hear." Deke sneered. "Careful she don't bite, or maybe you like it when they bite." Elias stiffened, his hand twitching toward the rifle scabbard on his saddle, but he held himself back. Violence now would only prove them right. He mounted his horse and turned toward the road. When he reached the ranch gate an hour later, he saw it. Pinned to the fresh wood of the fence post he had checked just days ago was a piece of paper. It fluttered in the wind. Elias leaned down and pulled it free. The handwriting was jagged, likely scrawled with a piece of charcoal. "Sin breeds sin. Cast out the whore, or the fire comes." Elias crushed the paper in his gloved fist. He looked toward the house, where smoke was rising from the chimney, a sign of life, of Lydia cooking, of a home that was no longer empty. He put the paper in his pocket. The wind scoured his face, cold and hard. He nudged Banjo forward, riding not toward retreat, but toward the fight of his life. The frost came early that year, a sharp, white silence that coated the sagebrush and froze the water in the troughs before the sun could crest the mesas. It was the kind of cold that found the gaps in the chinking of the log walls and settled into the bones. Elias Thorne stood at the kitchen table, a heavy leather-bound ledger open before him. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the room, a domestic scent that still felt strange to him after years of cold mornings and stale biscuits. Lydia stood by the stove, her back to him. She was turning the bacon with a long fork, her movements efficient but tense. She wore a dress he had bought from the catalog, a sturdy calico that fit her better than Martha's old things, though he tried not to notice how the cinched waist emphasized the curve of her hips. "Lydia," Elias said. She turned, the fork pausing in midair. Her eyes were wary, always expecting a dismissal. "I have been looking at the accounts," he said, tapping the ledger. "The ranch needs a bookkeeper. My handwriting is poor, and my math is slow. And I need someone to manage the stores, cook for the hands during roundup, and mend the tack." Lydia lowered the fork. "I have been doing the cooking." "Elias, and the mending." "Yes," Elias said, "but you have been doing it for keep. That ends today." He dipped a pen in the ink well and wrote a line in the book. "I am hiring you, $15 a month, plus room and board. You are on the payroll, same as Gideon and the boys. You are an employee of the Thorne Ranch." Lydia stared at him. "You are paying me?" "I am paying you for work done," Elias said, his voice flat, trying to keep the emotion out of it. "It makes it legitimate. If anyone asks, you are not a guest. You are hired help. It is a business arrangement." He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes. It was a shield. He was giving her a title, a reason to be there that the town could not easily tear down with words like kept woman or strumpet. It was a flimsy shield against the hatred of Jericho Creek, but it was the only one he had. "I can write," Lydia said softly. "My father was a school teacher before the war. I can keep your books." "Good," Elias said, closing the ledger. "Then it is settled. The first month is paid in advance." He placed 3 $5 gold pieces on the table. She looked at the gold, then up at his face. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded and turned to grab his coat. He could not look at her too long. The sight of her in his kitchen, safe and warm, stirred an ache in his chest that he had thought buried with Martha. It was a dangerous feeling, a betrayal of the dead, or so it felt in the cold light of morning. The work was hard, and the land was unforgiving. The high plains did not care about human dramas. They cared only about survival. The wind blew incessantly, drying the soil until it cracked. The cattle drifted toward the canyons, seeking shelter from the biting gusts. And Elias spent his days riding the fence lines, searching for breaks. Lydia worked with a ferocity that matched the landscape. She scrubbed laundry in boiling water until her knuckles were red and raw. She swept the bunkhouse, organized the pantry, and sat by the fire in the evenings, tallying the columns of figures in Elias's ledger. It was during these evenings, while the wind rattled the window panes, that the pieces of her past began to fall onto the table like dry leaves. "I was not always in the saloon," she said one night, her voice low. She was mending a tear in Elias's canvas coat. "My family came west from Ohio when I was 10. We had a claim near the river, but the fever took my mother, and the river took my father 2 years later during the floods." Elias watched the fire. "You were alone?" "I had a brother," she said. The needle flashed in the firelight. "Thomas, he was older. We went to Jericho Creek to find work. He worked at the mill. I found a place at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning. We were going to save enough to buy a small plot, just a garden and a house." She paused, biting the thread. "Thomas died in the mill accident 3 years ago, the one where the main beam snapped. After that, I had no protection." Elias remained silent, giving her the space to speak. "I stayed at the boarding house," she continued, her voice tightening. "But the owner sold it to Silas Vane's nephew. He turned the front parlor into a saloon. He told me I would serve drinks now, not just food. I tried to leave. Elias, I tried." "I know," Elias said. "There was a man," she said, staring at the coat in her lap. "A friend of the marshal. He decided he wanted more than a drink. He cornered me in the pantry. I hit him with a skillet. I broke his nose." She looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "They said I lured him back there. They said I tried to rob him. The marshal said if I didn't want to go to jail, I had to work it off. They made me into what they said I was. And when I finally fought back again, last week, when I bit the hand that tried to hold me down, I just ran." Elias felt a cold rage settle in his gut, heavy and sharp. He knew the man she spoke of. He knew the marshal. He knew how the machinery of the town chewed up the weak to feed the appetites of the strong. "You are not that thing they made you," Elias said, his voice rough. "You are Lydia Harper, and you are the bookkeeper of this ranch." He saw a single tear track through the dust on her cheek. He wanted to reach out and wipe it away. He wanted to pull her from the chair and hold her until the shaking stopped. But he stayed where he was, gripping the arms of his chair. He was a man of 40, a widower. He had no right to touch her, not when she had been hurt by every man who had ever reached for her. The tension between them grew, not from words, but from the silence. It lived in the small spaces where their lives overlapped. One afternoon, Elias decided she needed to know how to handle a firearm. The threats from town were becoming more than just paper notes. Riders had been seen watching the ranch from the ridge. He took her out behind the barn, setting up tin cans on the fence posts. He handed her his Winchester repeater. "It is heavy," he warned. Lydia took the rifle, the weight of it surprising her. She fumbled with the lever. "Here," Elias said. He stepped behind her. He did not mean to get so close, but he had to show her how to brace the stock against her shoulder. His chest brushed her back. He could smell the soap she used, lavender and lye, and the warmth of her hair. He reached around her arms to adjust her grip. His large, calloused hands covered hers. "Keep your elbows down," he murmured, his voice right at her ear. "Breathe out, squeeze, do not pull." Lydia froze. She did not pull away. She leaned back just a fraction of an inch, into his warmth. For a second, the rest of the world, the wind, the cows, the town, vanished. There was only the heat of his body shielding her from the cold air. Elias felt the contact burn through his shirt. He remembered the curve of Martha's back, the way she would lean into him on the porch, The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Guilt, sharp and agonizing. He stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "You have the stance," he said, his voice sounding harsh to his own ears. "Practice. I have to check the horses." He walked away fast, leaving her standing there with the rifle, the cold wind rushing back into the space he had left. He hated himself for the desire that uncoiled in his belly. He was protecting her. He could not be another man who looked at her and saw something to take. The town did not rest. The Sunday after he hired her, the prejudice began to tighten like a noose. Gideon, the oldest ranch hand, a man with skin like cured tobacco and a silent loyalty to Elias, brought the news from town. "They are talking, boss," Gideon said, leaning on his shovel in the stable. "Reverend Caldwell preached a sermon on the Jezebel in our midst. Said she is a rot that will spread. The women at the mercantile. They say they won't sell to you if you are buying for her." "Let them talk," Elias said, brushing down his horse. "It is not just talk," Gideon said gravely. "Marshal Coburn stopped me. Said he is looking into vagrancy laws. Said if she has no family and no husband, she is a ward of the state, and he can decide where she stays. And Silas Vane, he told the feed store to double the price on your grain." Elias stopped brushing. "Vane is squeezing the supply? He says your credit is no good anymore. Says a man who keeps a fallen woman can't be trusted to pay his debts." Elias threw the brush into the bucket with a clatter. It was one thing to insult him. It was another to threaten his livelihood. "Saddle the wagon," Elias said. "We are going to town." "Boss," Gideon warned, "that might not be wise." "I am not going to hide here while they starve us out," Elias said. "And Lydia is coming with me." The ride to Jericho Creek was silent. Lydia sat on the wagon bench beside Elias, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face pale. She had begged him not to do this. "I will leave," she had said. "I will walk into the mountains." But Elias had refused. "You are not a secret," he had told her, "and I will not live in shame." They rolled onto Main Street at noon. The town was busy, wagons clattering, people walking the boardwalks. As Elias pulled the team to a halt in front of Holloway's general store, the noise seemed to die away. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Elias set the brake. He jumped down and walked around to Lydia's side. He offered his hand. She hesitated, looking at the faces watching them. Faces she knew. Faces that had looked away when she was bruised. Faces that now looked at her with open disgust. "Take my hand," Elias said softly. "Look at me, not them." She took his hand. He gripped it firmly, his strength flowing into her, and helped her down. They walked toward the store. A group of women outside the millinery shop turned their backs in unison, pulling their skirts aside as if Lydia were contagious. "Shameless," one of them hissed, bringing her into the light of day. Elias ignored them. He opened the door to the general store and ushered Lydia inside. The store was warm and smelled of spices and sawdust. "Mister." Holloway stood behind the counter, looking nervous. "Elias," Holloway said, wiping his hands on his apron. I didn't expect you. I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of coffee, and winter boots for Miss Harper," Elias said, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet room. Holloway glanced at the other customers. "Elias, I can't." Vane said. "I am paying cash," Elias said, slapping a heavy leather pouch onto the counter. "Gold. Unless Silas Vane owns the U.S. Mint now. This money is good." Holloway looked at the gold, then at Elias's face. He nodded slowly. "Cash is cash, Elias." As Holloway measured the flour, a young woman emerged from the back room. It was Sarah, the schoolteacher's daughter. She was plain, quiet, and usually invisible. She walked up to Lydia, who was standing by a display of ribbons, trying to make herself small. Sarah held out a small tin. "For the dry skin," she whispered, pressing it into Lydia's hand. "The wind is hard this year." Lydia looked at her, shocked. My cousin was in trouble once," Sarah said quickly, her eyes darting to the door. "People can be cruel. Keep your head up." It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the wall of hatred, but it made Lydia straighten her spine. They left the store with their supplies, but the town had time to brew its poison. As they walked back to the wagon, a crowd had gathered. Not a mob. Not yet, but a knot of men standing by the watering trough. Deke was there, and a few of the saloon toughs. "Look at that," Deke called out. "Elias Thorne, walking his whore like a prize pony." Lydia flinched. Elias stopped. He handed Lydia the flour sack he was carrying and turned to face them. "You have something to say, Deke?" Elias asked. "I say you are a disgrace." Deke spat. "Bringing that filth onto the street where decent women walk. The only filth I see is the man standing before me," Elias said. Deke stepped forward, his face reddening. "You think you're better than us? You think you can pick up the town's trash and play house?" Someone in the back of the group threw something. It was a rotten apple, soft and brown. It sailed through the air and struck Lydia on the shoulder, splattering wet pulp onto her cheek and her clean dress. The crowd laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her face. The humiliation was a physical heat, burning her skin. She began to shake, the old terror rising up, the feeling of being small and dirty and helpless. Elias did not shout. He did not draw his gun. He moved with a terrifying calm. He stepped between Lydia and the men, his body becoming a wall. He took out his handkerchief and turned to her. "Hold still," he said. He wiped the pulp from her face. He did it slowly, deliberately, ignoring the men as if they were nothing more than buzzing flies. He cleaned her cheek, then her collar, then he turned back to Deke. Elias's eyes were like flint. "If anything else is thrown," Elias said, his voice low enough that they had to lean in to hear it, "I will not throw it back. I will break the arm that threw it, and I will start with you, Deke." The silence stretched, thin and tight as a wire. Deke looked at Elias, saw the absolute lack of fear, and stepped back. "Come, Lydia," Elias said. He took her arm and helped her into the wagon. He climbed up, released the brake, and drove out of town, his back straight, refusing to look back. Night fell over the ranch, heavy and starless. The wind had died, leaving a silence that felt oppressive after the noise of the town. Lydia sat at the kitchen table. She had not spoken since they left Jericho Creek. She was staring at her hands, which were resting on the oilcloth. Elias was pacing. He felt like a caged animal. The anger was still humming in his blood, a vibration that made his hands shake. "I am sorry," Lydia said suddenly. Her voice was brittle. Elias stopped. "You have nothing to apologize for." "I do," she said, looking up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I am the reason they hate you. I am the reason they threw things. I am a stain, Elias. You can't wash it off. You." "Stop it," Elias said. "Do not speak of yourself that way." "It is the truth," she cried, standing up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I want to be clean, but I am not. I want to be safe, but I am danger to you. I should have left. I should go now." She moved toward the door. "No!" Elias crossed the room in 2 strides. He blocked the door, his hands slamming against the wood above her head. They stood chest to chest, the air between them charged with the electricity of the storm that had been brewing for weeks. "Why?" Lydia demanded, looking up at him, her face wet with tears. "Why do you keep me? Why do you fight them for me?" "Because you are worth fighting for," Elias said, the words tearing out of him. "I am nobody," she sobbed. "I am just a woman who wants. She faltered. "What do you want, Lydia?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. She looked at him, her defenses finally crumbling. "I want to stay. I want to be here, with you. I want to feel safe. I want you." The confession hung in the air. Elias looked at her, her tear-streaked face, her trembling mouth, the desperate honesty in her eyes. The dam inside him broke. The guilt, the grief, the control, it all gave way to the simple, undeniable fact that he was a man who was alive, and she was the fire in his cold world. "Lydia," he groaned. He reached out, his hands cupping her face. Her skin was warm. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. He kissed her. It was not the smooth, practiced kiss of a romance novel. It was shaky and desperate. It tasted of salt tears and coffee. It was the collision of two lonely people who had forgotten what it was like to be held. Lydia made a small sound in her throat, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. For a moment, Elias let himself go. He deepened the kiss, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his body pressing her against the door. He felt the hunger in her, a matching force to his own. Then he remembered Deke. He remembered the bruise on her wrist. He remembered how easily men took what they wanted and called it right. He pulled back, breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. "Elias?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He kept his hands on her face, but he did not move to unbutton her dress. He did not move to carry her to the bedroom. "I want this," he said, his voice raspy. "I want you. Lydia, God help me, I do." "Then why did you stop?" He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Because you are scared, because you have been hunted, and I will never, ever make your body a battlefield again. When we do this, if we do this, it will be because we are free, not because you are afraid to say no." Lydia looked at him, and fresh tears spilled over. But these were not tears of shame. She reached up and touched his lips with her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias kissed her forehead, a benediction. "Go to sleep. Lydia, lock the door. You are safe here." He stepped away, his body aching with the effort of leaving her, and walked to the window to look out at the dark. He stood there for a long time, watching the night. And then he saw it. In the distance, on the southern ridge, a flicker of orange light. It grew brighter, flaring up against the black sky. It was not the sunrise. "Elias?" Lydia asked from the table. Elias grabbed his rifle from the rack. His face settled back into the hard lines of the rancher. "The protector." "Get down," he said. "They cut the fence." The orange light grew. It was the hay shed. They had set the winter feed on fire. Order had come to Jericho Creek. The charred remains of the hay shed stood like a blackened skeleton against the gray sky. A constant reminder that the heat in Jericho Creek was rising. The fire had taken 3 tons of winter feed. It was a calculated blow, precise and cruel, meant to force a surrender without firing a shot. Elias Thorne did not surrender. He worked with a grim fury, his days measured in the swing of a hammer and the grunt of lifting beams. He and Gideon, his oldest ranch hand, worked from dawn until the light failed, salvaging what timber they could to rebuild a smaller shelter for the horses. The wind had turned bitter, carrying the scent of snow from the peaks, and the cattle were drifting, restless and hungry, toward the sparse grazing in the sheltered draws. Lydia Harper did not hide in the house. She had traded her calico skirt for a pair of trousers cut down from an old pair of Elias's, cinched tight with a belt. The town would have called it a scandal. Elias called it practical. She hauled water, her hands reddened by the cold. She cooked heavy meals of beans and cornbread to fuel the men. She sat up late into the night, the ledger open, calculating how much grain they could afford to buy from the next county over, bypassing the blockade in Jericho Creek. She was not magically healed. The bruises on her soul were deeper than the ones fading from her wrists. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the wind snapped a sheet loudly. Lydia dropped the basket, falling into a crouch, her arms over her head, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The sound had been too much like a gunshot. Elias, who was oiling a harness on the porch, saw it. He did not rush over and coddle her. He knew that pity was a poison to someone trying to regain their strength. Instead, he spoke from where he sat, his voice calm and carrying over the wind. "It is just the wind. Lydia, the sheet snapped. Look at it." Lydia slowly lowered her arms. She looked at the white fabric dancing on the line. She looked at Elias, who was watching her with steady, unblinking eyes. He was anchoring her to the present. "I am sorry," she said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her knees. "Do not apologize for flinching," Elias said, returning to his work. "Just remember to stand back up." But the tension on the ranch was not just from the outside. It was festering within. Elias had 3 hands. Gideon was loyal to the bone. The other 2, younger drifters named Sims and Caleb, were growing uneasy. Caleb, a man with a narrow face and a habit of listening to gossip, watched Lydia with a mixture of sullen resentment and leering curiosity. "It ain't right, boss," Caleb muttered one evening at the supper table. He pushed his plate away. "We're losing money. People in town are saying this place is cursed. I heard Deke say they might burn the bunkhouse next. I didn't sign on to get roasted in my bed over a—" He flicked his eyes toward Lydia, who was pouring coffee. He didn't finish the word, but it hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Lydia's hand didn't shake, but her jaw tightened. "You signed on to work cattle and mend fences," Elias said. His voice was soft, dangerously so. He cut a piece of steak with surgical precision. "If the work is too hard for you, Caleb, or the company too refined for your taste, you can draw your pay tonight." Caleb looked at Elias, then at the rifle leaning against the wall. He spat on the floor. "I'll take my pay. I ain't dying for her." He left that night. Sim stayed, but he slept with one eye open. The circle of allies was shrinking. 2 days later, the law, or what passed for it in the territories, rode up the lane. It was not Marshal Coburn this time. It was a man in a black suit, riding a city buggy that looked ridiculous bouncing over the ruts. He introduced himself as Thaddeus Pearsall, a solicitor representing the county interests. Elias met him on the porch. Lydia stood in the doorway, a silent shadow. "Mr. Thorne," Pearsall said, dusting his hat. He had the soft hands of a man who strangled people with paper rather than rope. "I am afraid I have some troubling news regarding the deed to your southern pasture. The section with the creek. My father bought that land 30 years ago," Elias said. "The deed is in the safe." "Ah, yes, but a recent review of the survey lines from 1862 suggests a clerical error," Pearsall said, smiling without showing his teeth. "It appears that section actually falls under the jurisdiction of the Vein Trust, unpaid grazing taxes. You see, compounded over decades. It is a complicated matter." "It is not complicated," Elias said. "It is theft. It is the law. Mr. Thorne, Judge Halloway, cousin to the merchant, I believe, has issued a preliminary injunction. You are to vacate that section and remove your cattle until the matter is resolved. If you do not, the cattle will be considered trespassers and impounded." "Impounded means stolen by Silas Vane," Elias said. "I simply deliver the message," Pearsall said, climbing back into his buggy. "Oh, and Mr. Thorne, these legal battles can be very expensive. A man with a compromised reputation might find it hard to secure a loan for a defense." He tipped his hat to Lydia. "Ma'am." The buggy rattled away. Elias stood gripping the porch railing until the wood groaned. They were trying to strangle the ranch, cut off the water, and bleed him dry in court. He wanted to ride into town and put a bullet in the ledger book, but he knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted him to be the wild animal so they could put him down. The attacks came in waves. First the fire, then the law, then the church. On a Tuesday morning, a carriage arrived carrying Reverend Caldwell and 3 women from the Moral Committee. They were dressed in severe black, their faces pinched with the self-importance of the righteous. They did not come to the house. They waited by the gate, as if the soil itself was contaminated. Elias walked out to meet them. Lydia followed, stopping 10 paces behind him. "Elias," Reverend Caldwell boomed. He was a large man who used his voice like a bludgeon. "We have come to offer a solution, a path to redemption." "I did not know I was lost." "Reverend," Elias said. "Not you, man. Her." Caldwell pointed a thick finger at Lydia. "The town is in an uproar. You are endangering the souls of good families by harboring a woman of ill repute in a bachelor's home. It is a scandal that cries out to heaven." One of the women, Mrs. Gable stepped forward. "We have arranged a place for her. Mr. Thorne. The Sisters of Mercy in Denver run a home for wayward women. She will be taken there. She will scrub floors and pray. She will be cleansed of her sin. She is not a stain on a rug." "Mrs. Gable," Elias said. "She is a temptress," Caldwell shouted. "She has beguiled you. Look at you, a decent man, defying your neighbors for a piece of—" "Be careful, Reverend," Elias warned. Stepping forward, "We are taking her," Caldwell said, "for her own good. Marshal Coburn says if she is not turned over to the church, he will arrest her for solicitation." "I am not going," Lydia said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind. She stepped up beside Elias. She was trembling, but her head was high. "I am not wayward," she said, looking Mrs. Gable in the eye. "And I am not a child to be shipped off to scrub your guilt away. I work here. I earn my keep." "You are a kept woman," Mrs. Gable hissed. "No," Elias said. His voice was like iron striking stone. "She is my partner." The word hung in the cold air. Partner. In the West, that word meant more than wife, more than friend. It meant the person who rode beside you, who held the other end of the saw, who you trusted with your life when the blizzard came. "Partner," Caldwell sputtered, "you blaspheme. You elevate this whore to the station of a partner? She runs my books. She manages my supply. She works this land." Elias said, "She is under my protection, and she is my partner in this ranch. And if any man or woman tries to remove her against her will, they will have to step over me to do it." He placed his hand on the revolver at his hip. "Get off my land." The committee retreated, their outrage billowing like smoke. But as they left, Elias knew he had crossed a line. He had given her dignity. To the town. That was the unforgivable sin. That night, the siege mentality that had gripped the ranch broke into something else. The house was dark, save for the fire in the hearth. The wind was howling outside, a lonely, desolate sound that made the walls feel thin. Lydia sat on the rug by the fire, her knees pulled to her chest. Elias sat in his armchair, cleaning his rifle. "You called me your partner," she said softly. Elias paused, the rag in his hand. "It is the truth. They will kill you for it. Elias, they can't stand it." "Let them try." She turned to look at him. The firelight cast shadows across her face, highlighting the new strength in her jaw and the old sadness in her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you stand in the fire for me?" Elias set the rifle down. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Because before you came, I was already dead. Lydia, I was just walking around doing chores. You woke me up." The distance between them, usually maintained by a rigorous wall of propriety, suddenly seemed foolish. They were two people in a wooden box in the middle of a hostile ocean. Lydia stood up. She walked to him. She did not look frightened. She looked starved. Starved for a touch that didn't hurt, for a word that wasn't a transaction. "Elias," she whispered. He stood. He towered over her, but he made himself small, bowing his head. When he reached for her, his hands were shaking. She stepped into him, pressing her face against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, and the contact was like a shock. It wasn't the frantic, tearing lust of a saloon encounter. It was a wave of desperate tenderness. "I am afraid," she admitted into his shirt. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I am too." "Not of you," she said, looking up. "Never of you." He kissed her then, and the restraint of the last weeks shattered. It was a hungry, deep kiss. Fueled by the adrenaline of the day and the coldness of the night, he lifted her legs wrapping around his waist, and carried her not to the bunkhouse, but to the bedroom, the room he had not shared since Martha died. But this was not Martha. This was Lydia. She was alive. She was warm. And she was here. They moved with a frantic need for closeness. Clothes were discarded not for the sake of nudity, but to remove the barriers between skin and skin. When they lay together, the act was not a conquest. It was a conversation. It was Elias holding his weight off her, watching her face for any sign of fear. It was Lydia pulling him down, her hands mapping the scars on his back, realizing that this strong, terrifying man was trembling just as much as she was. There was no shame in the dark. There was only the sound of their breathing and the wind outside, which could no longer reach them. The morning brought a cruel beauty. The sun was bright, reflecting off the frost. Lydia woke first. She lay still, feeling the weight of Elias's arm across her waist. For a moment, she felt a profound, golden sense of safety. She was warm. She was wanted. Then the old terror struck. Safety never lasts. You have something to lose now. She sat up, clutching the sheet. Elias stirred and opened his eyes. He looked at her, and his face softened. He reached out and touched her bare shoulder. "Morning," he rasped. "Morning," she whispered. She looked at him, her heart hammering. "Elias, what happens now?" "Now," he said, sitting up and swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "We make coffee, and we keep fighting, but the town had other plans." At mid-morning, Gideon came riding in from the south pasture. He was slumped over the neck of his horse. Elias dropped the axe he was holding and ran. He pulled Gideon from the saddle. The old man's face was a mask of blood. His left arm hung at a sickening angle. "Gideon!" Elias shouted. "Lydia, get the kit!" They laid him on the porch. Gideon groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Wire!" Gideon wheezed. "They cut the wire. Drove the herd. Stampede." "Who?" Elias demanded, pressing a cloth to the gash on Gideon's head. "Masks." Gideon coughed. "But I saw Deke's horse, the paint with the white stocking." Lydia knelt beside them, her hands working fast to bind the arm, but her face was ashen. She looked at Gideon's blood staining the porch planks. She looked at Elias's face, which had turned into a mask of cold, murderous rage. Then Sims rode in, leading a pack horse. He looked scared. "Boss," Sims said, "I was in town. I heard about Mr. Holloway." "What about him?" Elias barked without looking up. "They beat him. Boss, last night, smashed up his store. Left a sign saying, 'Traitor' on the door. He's bad off. The doc says he might lose an eye." Lydia stood up. She backed away, her hands covered in Gideon's blood. "It is me," she whispered. "It is all me." "Lydia, no," Elias said, looking up. "They hurt Gideon," she said, her voice rising to a panic. "They hurt Mr. Holloway because he sold me flour. They will kill you next. Elias, they will burn this house with us inside." She turned and ran into the house. Elias finished tying the bandage on Gideon. "Sims, get him water. Watch him." He followed Lydia. She was in the bedroom, shoving her few clothes into a canvas sack. She was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her body. "I am going," she said. "I will go to town. I will tell the marshal I surrender. I will tell them I seduced you. I tricked you. I will tell them anything so they stop hurting people." Elias grabbed the bag and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud. "You will not," he said. "I have to," she screamed at him. "Don't you see? I am the poison. I am the reason good men are bleeding." Elias grabbed her by the shoulders. He was not gentle this time. He shook her once, hard. "You are not the poison," he roared. "They are. Do you think if you leave, they will stop? Do you think Deke and Vane and that hypocrite Caldwell will just go back to being decent? No, they have tasted blood. Lydia, if you surrender, they win. They learn that terror works. They learn that they can break anything that doesn't look like them." He pulled her close, forcing her to look at him. "I saw Gideon's blood," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "I see what they did to Holloway, being good, being quiet, minding our own business. It is not enough. It was never enough." He let her go and walked to the gun cabinet. He took out his heavy buffalo rifle and a box of cartridges. He strapped on his revolver. "Elias," Lydia whispered. "What are you doing?" "I am done waiting for them to come to us," Elias said. He put on his hat. The shadow of the brim hid his eyes, but she could feel the heat of his resolve. "I am going to town. I am going to find Marshal Coburn. And I am going to end this. They will kill you," she said. "Then I will die on my feet." Elias said, instead of on my knees waiting for their permission to breathe. He walked out the door. Lydia watched him go. She saw him mount the big roan, saw the way he checked the action on the rifle. She wiped the tears from her face. The fear was still there, but something else was rising beneath it. She looked at the blood on her hands. She did not pack her bag again. Instead, she went to the mantel and took down the Winchester he had taught her to use. Elias rode toward the gate, the wind at his back. He did not look at the broken fences. He looked only at the road to Jericho Creek. He was a peaceful man, a quiet man. But the town had made a mistake. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, and now they were going to learn the difference. Elias rode 40 miles to the county seat of Blackwood, a town that smelled of coal smoke and bureaucracy. He spent 3 days sitting on a hard wooden bench outside the circuit judge's chambers, clutching a sheaf of affidavits he had painstakingly gathered. He had a statement from the midwife, Mrs. Albright, who had seen Lydia's bruises. He had a guarded testimony from Sarah, the schoolteacher's daughter. When he was finally granted an audience, Judge Pembroke, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen too much frontier corruption to care, barely looked up from his desk. "This is a local matter, Mr. Thorne," Pembroke said, shuffling the papers. "Assault is a crime, yes, but without a witness willing to testify against a specific man, and with the marshal of Jericho Creek disputing the events, it is your word against the town's, and frankly, your reputation has taken a battering of late." "My reputation is not on trial," Elias said, his voice tight. "A woman was beaten. A ranch hand was assaulted. Fences were cut. This is organized lawlessness." "It is a moral dispute," Pembroke said, waving a hand. "I can schedule a hearing for the spring circuit. April, perhaps." "April?" Elias stood up, his chair scraping the floor. "We will be dead by Christmas. Then I suggest you move, Mr. Thorne. The law takes time. Justice is a slow mule." Elias rode back to Jericho Creek with the taste of ash in his mouth. The law was a shield made of paper, and it would not stop a bullet. Life on the ranch had become a siege. The windows of the main house were boarded up, leaving only narrow slits for light and rifles. The cattle had been moved to the high pasture, a box canyon that was easier to defend but harder to supply. Lydia and Elias moved around each other like ghosts in the darkened house. The strain was a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the coyote made them freeze. "You should sleep," Lydia said one evening. Elias was standing by the window slit. Staring into the dark, he looked haggard, his eyes rimmed with red. "I am not tired," he lied. "You are exhausted," she snapped. The fear made her sharp. "You will fall off your horse before you save anyone." Elias turned, his temper flaring. "And who will watch the gate? Lydia? Sims? He is a boy. Gideon is lying in the bunkhouse with a fever." "I can watch the gate," she said, crossing her arms. "No," Elias said. "You stay inside." "I am not a piece of china. Elias, I am the reason we are in this cage. Do not treat me like I am useless." They stared at each other, the air vibrating with the frustration of trapped animals. Then Elias sighed, the anger draining out of him, leaving only the fear. "I know you are not useless," he said quietly. "I am just terrified that I will fail you." It was the first time he had admitted it. Lydia softened. She walked over and placed a hand on his arm. The touch was brief, but it anchored him. "We are just tired," she whispered. The next day, Elias rode to the edge of town to meet a contact, Pearl, the madam of the Golden Garter. She had sent a boy with a note, asking to meet by the old mill. It was a risk, but Elias needed to know the enemy's mind. Pearl was a large woman with dyed red hair and eyes that were surprisingly kind. She smoked a cheroot, leaning against the rotting wood of the mill. "You are a fool, Elias," she said by way of greeting. "Likely," Elias admitted. "They are coming for her," Pearl said, watching the smoke drift. "The Committee of Decency. Vane is funding it, Caldwell is blessing it, and Coburn is looking the other way." "Why?" Elias asked. Why do they hate her so much? She did nothing? Pearl laughed, a harsh, dry sound. Oh, honey, you think this is about what she did? It is about what she is. She is the mirror. Elias, half the men in that town visited the boarding house when Vane's nephew turned it into a sty. They know what happened to her. They know what they did, or what they watched happen. If she walks around with her head high, if a decent man like you treats her like a lady, then they have to look at themselves, and they don't like what they see. It is easier to call her a devil and burn her than to admit they are the sinners. She flicked the ash into the creek. They want a scapegoat. You are denying them their sacrifice. As Elias rode back, he was intercepted. Silas Vane sat on a massive bay horse at the crossroads, flanked by 2 armed riders. Elias, Vane said, his voice smooth as oil. He was a man who wore suits made of silk in a land of denim. Silas, this has gone far enough. Don't you think? Vane gestured to the landscape. Halloway is blind in one eye. Your man Gideon is crippled. People are getting hurt. You would know about that, Elias said. I am a businessman. I like peace. Vane said, so here's the offer. You hand the girl over to the marshal. She goes on the stagecoach, away from here. You sign the deed for the creek section over to the trust to cover the back taxes. We drop the lawsuits. The town forgets. You go back to being the decent, quiet widower. Elias looked at Vane. He looked at the hired guns. And what happens to her when the stagecoach leaves? Elias asked. Vane shrugged. She finds her level. Water always does. Elias tightened his grip on the reins. There is no deal. Silas, not for an acre of land, not for a blade of grass, and certainly not for her. Vane's face hardened. Then you are choosing ruin. Elias, tonight, the town is done talking. Elias rode banjo hard, the hooves thundering against the frozen earth. He hit the ranch yard at a gallop. Sims, he shouted. Get the horses into the corral, bar the barn doors. Lydia ran out onto the porch, the Winchester in her hand. What is it? They are coming, Elias said, dismounting on the run. Tonight, Vane gave the order. The sun set behind the mesas, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and blood orange. They prepared for war. Elias moved Gideon, who was feverish but conscious, into the main house, laying him on the rug behind the heavy oak table. Sims, the young hand who had stayed when Caleb ran, was pale. He was only 19, a boy from Missouri who liked to play the harmonica. You don't have to stay, Sims, Elias told him as they boarded the last window. I ain't got nowhere else. Boss, Sims said, checking his revolver. And I don't like bullies. They doused the lamps. They waited. The moon rose, high and cold. The wind whistled through the gaps in the boards. Lydia sat on a crate by the window, the rifle resting on the sill. She was not shaking. She had passed beyond fear into a cold, crystalline focus. Do you remember the first day? She asked softly in the dark. I remember, Elias said from the other side of the room. I told you to let me go. You should have listened. I have made many mistakes in my life, Elias said. That was not one of them. Then they heard it, the low rumble of hooves, the sound of men shouting, bolstered by whiskey and righteousness. Torches appeared on the ridge, a snake of fire winding down toward the house. There were at least 20 of them. Steady, Elias whispered. Do not fire unless they breach the fence. The mob stopped at the main gate. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He held his buffalo rifle across his chest. He stood in the pool of light cast by the porch lantern. A perfect target, but he needed them to see him. Go home, Elias's voice boomed out. This is private property. We want the woman, a voice shouted. It sounded like the blacksmith. Send out the whore, and we leave you be. There is no one here but free citizens, Elias shouted back. Step past that gate, and you are trespassing. I will defend my home. A bottle smashed against the gatepost. A torch was thrown, arching through the night sky. It landed in the dry brush near the bunkhouse. Burn them out, someone screamed. The gate burst open. Horses surged through. Now, Elias yelled. He raised the rifle and fired into the air. a warning shot that sounded like a cannon. The mob did not stop. They were past reasoning. Bullets began to thud into the logs of the house. Glass shattered. Lydia fired from the window. She aimed low, at the ground in front of the horses, trying to turn them. She worked the lever with a mechanical precision. Crack, click, clack, crack. Sims was at the side window. "They're circling around. They're going for the back door. Cover the back, Sims!" Elias shouted, firing again, this time hitting a rider's shoulder, knocking him from the saddle. The yard was chaos. Smoke from the burning brush drifted across the porch. Men were shouting, horses screaming. Sims ran to the kitchen. The back door shuddered under a heavy blow. A boot kicked it open. "Get back!" Sims yelled. He fired his pistol. A shotgun blast roared from the darkness of the yard. Sims was thrown backward as if yanked by a rope. He hit the stove and slid to the floor, his chest a ruin of red. "Sims!" Lydia screamed. She abandoned her post, running to the kitchen. Elias heard the scream. He fired one last shot from the porch, dropping a man who was trying to light the porch steps, and then retreated inside, bolting the heavy door. He ran to the kitchen. Lydia was on her knees, holding Sims's head. The boy's eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling. He tried to speak, but only a bubble of blood escaped his lips. He shuddered once, and then he was still. The shooting outside stopped. The mob, realizing they had killed a man, a boy who had grown up in their midst, faltered. The drunken courage evaporated in the face of real death. "We got one," someone shouted uncertainly. Let's go before the marshal comes." Another voice panicked, even though the marshal wasn't coming. The sound of hooves retreated, fading into the night. Inside the kitchen, the silence was deafening. The only sound was the crackling of the brush fire outside, which was slowly dying out in the frost. Lydia looked at Sims. She looked at his harmonica peeking out of his shirt pocket, now stained dark. She let out a sound that was not a word. It was a keen of pure, unadulterated agony. She scrambled backward, away from the body, until she hit the wall. "Stop it!" she gasped, clawing at her own hair. "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!" Elias dropped his rifle. He went to her. He fell to his knees and tried to pull her hands away from her face. "Lydia," he said, his voice broken. "Look at him!" she screamed at Elias, her eyes wild. "He is dead. He is 19 years old and he is dead because of me, because I am here, because I wanted to live." She tried to push Elias away. "Let me go. I will walk out there and let them kill me. It is the only way to stop the blood. Please, Elias, just let me die so you can live." Elias did not let her go. He grabbed her wrists, overpowering her frantic struggles. He pulled her hard against his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tight she could not move. "No," he growled into her ear. "No," she sobbed, her body convulsing. "It's forbidden," she choked out. "Being happy, being safe. It's forbidden for me. The price is too high." Elias held her while she shook, his own tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. He looked at Sim's body. He looked at the bullet holes in his walls. "The forbidden thing," Elias said, his voice low and vibrating with a new, terrifying clarity, "is not loving you, Lydia. It is not us. It is them. It is their belief that cruelty is righteousness. It is their belief that they own the right to say who lives and who dies." He pulled back enough to look at her. His hands framed her face, smearing blood and soot on her skin. "We are alive," he said fiercely. "Do you hear me? We are alive." Lydia looked at him. She saw the grief in his eyes, but she also saw the love. Not a soft, poetic love, but a love forged in iron and fire. "Elias," she whispered. She collapsed against him. They clung to each other on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken glass and death. They touched each other's faces, shoulders, hands, desperate to confirm the warmth of life. It was not sexual. It was elemental. It was two survivors finding the only solid ground left in a world that had turned to ash. Elias kissed her hair, her forehead, her eyelids. I am here. I have you." They stayed there until the dawn began to turn the sky a bruised gray. When the light came, it illuminated the wreckage. The kitchen was destroyed. Sims lay covered by a sheet. Gideon was asleep in the other room, alive but weak. Elias stood up. He helped Lydia to her feet. He looked different. The weary rancher who just wanted to be left alone was gone. In his place was a man who had nothing left to lose. "We cannot stay here," Elias said. "If we stay, they will come back with more men. They will burn the house down around our ears." "Where can we go?" Lydia asked. Her voice was hollow. "We do not run," Elias said. "We attack." He walked to the loose floorboard under the pantry shelf. He pried it up and pulled out a metal box. Inside were the original land deeds, his savings, and the fraudulent tax notices Pearsall had served him. "We are going to the capital," Elias said. "We are going to find the federal marshal, and we are going to find a newspaper man." "The capital is a week's ride," Lydia said. "It is winter." "Then we ride through winter," Elias said. "We will take the evidence. We will take your testimony. And we will take the truth about Holloway, and Sims, and the bribes." He looked at Lydia. "Vane thinks he owns the law here, but he doesn't own the world. We are going to burn his kingdom down. Lydia, not with fire, with paper, and with the truth." Lydia looked at the metal box. She looked at Sims's covered form. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I will saddle the horses," she said. Elias watched her go. He picked up the rifle. He would mourn Sims later. He would mourn the peace he had lost later. Right now, there was only the cold morning, the long road, and the woman he would burn the world to protect. The land beyond the Thorn Ranch was not merely empty. It was hostile. It was a vast, rolling ocean of gray sage and frozen earth, broken only by the jagged teeth of sandstone ridges that cut into the pale underbelly of the sky. Elias and Lydia had been riding for 4 days. They moved like fugitives, keeping to the low ground, following the dry washes where the banks hid them from the horizon. The wind was a relentless physical assault, stripping the heat from their bodies and cracking their lips until they bled. They were hunted. It wasn't a formal posse, lawful and documented. It was a pack of hired guns, authorized by the shadow law of Silas Vane, and legitimized by the lies spreading through Jericho Creek like a fever. The story, they knew, would be simple. The mad rancher had finally snapped, kidnapping the poor, unstable woman to take her into the wilds for unspeakable purposes. It was a lie that gave every man with a rifle the moral permission to shoot on sight. Elias rode Banjo, his rifle scabbard unbuckled. Lydia rode a mare they had taken from the barn, a sturdy bay named Bess. She rode astride, her legs wrapped in wool and leather, her face hidden behind a scarf. She did not complain. She did not ask to stop. She rode with a grim, white-knuckled determination that made Elias's chest ache with a mixture of pride and sorrow. On the 5th afternoon, the weather turned, the sky bruised purple, and the temperature dropped hard. "We need shelter," Elias shouted over the wind. "The canyon ahead! There is an overhang!" As they crested the rise leading to the canyon mouth, a crack echoed through the valley, sharp, flat, and unmistakable. Dirt kicked up near Banjo's front hoof. "Ride!" Elias roared. He wheeled his horse, putting himself between Lydia and the ridge to the east. Another shot whined past his ear, sounding like an angry hornet. Lydia kicked the mare into a gallop. They plunged down the scree slope, sliding and scrambling toward the cover of the rocks. Elias pulled his Winchester, twisting in the saddle to fire 3 rapid shots toward the ridge, not aiming to kill, but to force heads down. They hit the canyon floor, the walls rising up to cut off the line of sight. They didn't stop. They pushed the horses through the twisting labyrinth of stone until the light began to fail and the silence returned, heavy and cold. They made camp in a shallow cave, hidden from the rim. There was no wood for a fire, so they huddled together in the dark, sharing body heat under the heavy buffalo robes. "You are bleeding," Lydia said. Her voice was small in the darkness. Elias touched his left arm. The sleeve of his coat was wet. A bullet had grazed him, slicing a furrow through the sheepskin and the flesh beneath. "It is a scratch," Elias said. "Let me see." She struck a lucifer match. The flare of light illuminated her face, gaunt, dirty, eyes wide with fatigue, but steady. She had the medical kit from her saddlebags. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. Elias hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. He watched her hands. They were the hands of a woman who had been told she was helpless. Yet here she was, stitching his flesh in a freezing cave while men hunted them for sport. "They are close," she whispered, tying off the bandage. "They will lose the trail in the rock," Elias said. "The wind will cover our tracks." Lydia sat back against the stone wall. Her breath hitched. The adrenaline was fading, leaving room for the panic to creep in. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "They will say I went willingly," she said, her voice trembling. "Or they will say I tempted you. And when they kill us, they will say it was justice." Elias reached out, but he stopped before he touched her. He waited until she looked at him. "Lydia," he said softly, "look at me." She met his eyes. "We are not going to die in this canyon," he said, "and we are not going to let them write the story. You have the papers?" She patted the heavy canvas satchel she refused to let go of. "Yes, then we have the truth, and the truth is heavier than lead." She looked at him, searching for the doubt she felt in herself. She found none. She saw only the rock-solid certainty of a man who had chosen a side and would not move. She moved closer to him, sliding under his arm. "Hold me," she whispered. "Just for a minute, before the cold gets in." Elias wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her tight against his side. They slept in shifts, the rifle across Elias's lap, listening to the coyotes singing to a moon that looked like a polished bone. 2 days later, they reached Granite Peak. It was a rail town, ugly and loud, built on coal dust and iron. But it had something Jericho Creek did not. It was the seat of the federal district court for the territory. They did not go to a hotel. They went straight to the depot, where the telegraph office buzzed like a hive of mechanical bees. Elias sent a message to a man named Samuel Bassett, a U.A. marshal he had known years ago during the cattle wars, a man who had a reputation for hating bullies more than he hated horse thieves. Bassett met them in a private room at the back of a boarding house near the tracks. He was a man of 50, built like a whiskey barrel, with a mustache that drooped past his chin and eyes that were hard as agate. He listened while Elias spoke. He looked at the tax papers, the fraudulent deed, and the ledger Elias had taken from the ranch, the one that showed the payments to the Jericho Creek Civic Fund, a thin veil for Vane's bribery network. "This is compelling, Elias," Bassett rumbled, his voice gravelly. "But it is paper. Vane has lawyers who can turn paper into confetti, to bring federal charges, conspiracy, deprivation of rights, corruption. I need a witness. I need to know why. Why the hate? Why the violence?" Bassett turned his gaze to Lydia. He did not look at her with lust or judgment. He looked at her like a judge. "Mrs. Harper," Bassett said, "I need the statement. The full statement, not the polite version." Lydia sat in the stiff wooden chair. Her hands were clasped in her lap so tightly the knuckles were white. She looked at Elias. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. "Your choice." Lydia turned to the marshal. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest, and then she began to speak. She spoke of the boarding house. She spoke of the night Vane's nephew, a man named Julian, had cornered her. She spoke of the marshal, Coburn, standing outside the door, ensuring no one interfered. She spoke of the assault, not in vague terms, but with the brutal, humiliating specifics of dates, times, and acts. She spoke of the threat Vane himself had made when she tried to go to the magistrate. "A woman with your history has no voice. Disappear, or we will make you disappear." She told him how the town had turned, how the women looked away because seeing her pain meant admitting their own vulnerability, how respectability became a weapon to bludgeon her into silence. The room was silent when she finished. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Elias felt a cold, black rage rising in his gut. He had known it was bad. He had not known it was this, the image of Coburn standing guard. It made him want to ride back, burn the town to the ground, and shoot every man who had stood by. He wanted blood. He wanted to be the monster they claimed he was. Bassett cleared his throat. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. "I believe you, ma'am," Bassett said quietly. He looked at Elias. He saw the murder in the rancher's eyes. "Elias," Bassett warned. "I am going to kill them," Elias said. His voice was dead flat. "Vane, Coburn, Julian." "If you do," Bassett said, "then she is just the woman who drove a good man to murder. The story remains theirs. You want to save her? You want to give her a life? Then you let the law do the hanging. You let the world see them in chains, not in coffins." Elias looked at Lydia. She was watching him, terrified, not of the marshal, but of what Elias might become for her sake. He closed his eyes. He took a breath, forcing the red haze back. He chose her. He chose a world where she could walk down the street without looking over her shoulder. "We go back," Elias said. "We do it your way. Sam." They returned to Jericho Creek on a Tuesday, the day the circuit court was scheduled for its quarterly session in the town hall. They did not ride in alone. Marshal Bassett brought 4 federal deputies, men with repeating rifles and badges that meant business. They rode down Main Street in a tight formation, Elias and Lydia in the center. The town went quiet. People stopped on the boardwalks. Curtains twitched. The sight of Elias Thorne, the man they said had gone mad, riding beside a U.S. Marshal, sent a shockwave through the dust. They rode straight to the town hall, a white clapboard building that served as both court and church. Inside, Judge Holloway, the merchant's cousin, was presiding over a land dispute. The room was full. Silas Vane sat in the front row, looking bored and expensive. Marshal Coburn leaned against the back wall. When the doors banged open, every head turned. "All rise," Bassett boomed, his voice filling the room. "Federal business." Bassett walked down the center aisle, his spurs jingling. Elias and Lydia followed. Elias held his head high. Lydia walked beside him, pale but moving under her own power. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Judge Holloway demanded, banging his gavel. "I'm United States Marshal Samuel Bassett," he announced, "and I am here to execute arrest warrants for conspiracy, fraud, and deprivation of civil rights." A murmur rippled through the room. Silas Vane stood up slowly. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Marshal Bassett, you are a long way from your jurisdiction. Surely you haven't been listening to the tall tales of a disgraced rancher and his companion." "I have been listening to evidence, Mr. Vane," Bassett said. "Sit down." "I will not," Vane said. He turned to the crowd, playing his hand. "Neighbors, look at this. A man who harbors a harlot, who shoots at our sons, now brings federal thugs to intimidate us. This is an attack on our community, on our values." "Your values?" Elias stepped forward. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a knife. "Your values are burning barns. Your values are beating old men. Your values are holding a door shut while a woman screams." The room went deadly silent. Reverend Caldwell stood up, his face red. "You speak of values. Elias Thorne, you who lives in sin with that woman. You parade her here in this house of law and lecture us?" "She has a name," Elias said. He turned to Lydia. He took her hand. He did not care that Vane was watching. He did not care that the town was staring with their hungry, judging eyes. "Her name is Lydia Harper," Elias said, addressing the room. "And she is not my mistress. She is not my captive." He looked at Lydia. The moment stretched. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear of being claimed, of being owned. He knew what he had to do. He had to give her the one thing the town had tried to take, her agency. "Lydia," he said, loud enough for the back row to hear, "I am asking you, before God and this town, will you stand with me? Not as a rescue, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose it. Will you marry me and be my partner in this life?" Lydia stopped breathing. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the women who had shunned her, the men who had jeered. Then she looked at Elias. He wasn't offering her shelter. He was offering her a sword. He was asking her to stand beside him in the fire. He was telling the town that she was worthy of the highest honor a man could give, and he was daring them to object. "I choose you, Elias," she said clearly. "I choose you." "Then let it be known," Elias said, turning back to Vane. "She is my betrothed, and anyone who speaks against her speaks against my wife." "Touching," Vane sneered. "Truly. But she is still a whore, and you are still a thief who hasn't paid his taxes." "The taxes were paid," Bassett interrupted, holding up the ledger. "To your private fund. Vane, we have the book. We have the dates. And we have the testimony of your nephew, Julian, who we picked up in Granite Peak yesterday. He talks quite a bit when he's facing 20 years in a federal pen." Vane's face went the color of old ash. "Arrest him," Bassett ordered. The deputies moved. Coburn, at the back of the room, made a move for his gun. "Don't do it. Coburn," Bassett warned, his hand already on his Colt. Coburn froze. He looked at Vane, then at the deputies. He raised his hands. The room erupted. People were shouting. The illusion of Vane's invincibility shattered like glass. A woman in the third row, Mrs. Albright, the midwife, stood up. "It is true," she shouted, her voice shaking. "I saw the bruises. I treated her, and Coburn told me to keep my mouth shut or my shop would burn." "I saw them cut the fence," another voice cried out. It was the blacksmith. "Deke and his boys!" The dam broke. The fear that had held the town together dissolved into a chaotic release of truth. It should have ended there. But the snake still had its head, as the deputies cuffed Vane and led him down the aisle. Vane's eyes met the eyes of a man sitting near the window, a drifter named Skinner, a man who did the jobs even Deke wouldn't do. Vane gave a slight nod. As the group moved out onto the steps of the town hall, into the bright, cold winter sun, the crowd followed, buzzing with the energy of the spectacle. Elias held Lydia's hand. He felt a profound sense of relief, a loosening of the knot that had been in his chest for months. "It is over," he whispered to her. "Elias!" Lydia screamed. She saw the glint of metal from the alley across the street before anyone else. She didn't think. She threw her body weight against him, shoving him hard to the right. The crack of a rifle shattered the air. The bullet, meant for Elias's heart, tore through the sleeve of his coat and slammed into the doorframe behind him, sending splinters flying. "Down!" Bassett roared. Chaos exploded. The crowd screamed and scattered. Elias hit the deck, pulling Lydia down with him behind the low stone wall of the porch. "Where is it coming from?" Elias shouted, drawing his revolver. "The livery roof!" a deputy yelled. Bassett and his men opened fire, a barrage of lead that chewed up the false front of the livery stable. Skinner, the assassin, popped up to fire again, aiming for Lydia this time. Elias saw him. He didn't wait for the law. He raised his revolver, steadied his hand on the stone wall, and fired a single shot. Skinner jerked back, his rifle falling to the street below, followed a second later by his body, which hit the dust with a final, heavy thud. Silence rushed back in, ringing in their ears. Elias turned to Lydia. She was pressed against the stones, gasping for air, her hands clutching his lapel. "Are you hit?" he demanded, scanning her frantically for blood. "No," she wheezed. "No, you?" "I am fine." He pulled her into his arms, crushing her to him. They lay there on the cold stone of the church steps, surrounded by shouting deputies and a town in shock. Bassett walked over, his gun still drawn. He looked at the dead man in the street, then at Vane, who was being held face down in the dirt by two deputies. Add attempted murder of a federal witness to the list. Bassett growled. Elias sat up. He helped Lydia to her feet. They stood before the town of Jericho Creek. They were covered in dust. They were shaking, but they were standing. The townspeople looked at them. The judgment was gone, replaced by a stunned, fearful awe. They had seen the corruption exposed. They had seen the violence, and they had seen a woman who was supposed to be weak save the life of the man who loved her. Vane was dragged away, shouting threats that no one listened to anymore. Coburn was marched off in irons. Elias looked at the crowd. He saw Halloway, the merchant, looking at his shoes. He saw the Reverend, silent and pale. "Let's go home," Elias said to Lydia. "Home?" she asked. "The ranch," he said. "We have fences to fix." They walked down the steps, past the marshal, past the wreckage of the town's order. They walked to their horses, mounted, and rode out of Jericho Creek. They did not look back, but as they rode, Elias knew that while the battle was won, the war for peace would be long. The town would not forgive them for being the mirror that showed them their own ugliness. Vane had friends in the capital. The hate would hide, festering in the dark corners. But he looked at Lydia, riding beside him, her back straight, her face turned toward the open plain and the mountains beyond. She was not a victim anymore. She was his partner, and for the first time in years, the wind on his face didn't feel like a scouring. It felt like a beginning. The law came to Jericho Creek, but it did not come like a cleansing rain. It came like a slow, grinding frost that cracked the stones of the town's foundation. Silas Vane did not go quietly. It took 3 deputies to haul him into the iron-barred wagon destined for the territorial prison. He spat threats of lawsuits and political favors until the door clanged shut, but the silence that followed was heavy. Marshal Coburn, stripped of his badge and his gun, looked smaller, a man deflated by the sudden absence of the fear he had used as a crutch. The charges were long: conspiracy, extortion, assault, attempted murder. The federal prosecutor, a man with ink-stained fingers and no patience for frontier warlords, laid out the evidence Elias and Lydia had carried through the snow. The ledger spoke of bribes. The letters spoke of intent. And the testimony of Julian, Vane's nephew, provided the final nail in the coffin, driven in by the boy's desire to save his own skin. But as the wagon rolled out of town, kicking up dust that settled on the windows of the church, Elias stood on the boardwalk and felt no triumph. He felt only a hollow ache in his chest. Justice had been served, but the bill was exorbitant. He looked at Lydia. She stood beside him, watching the wagon disappear. She was not smiling. She wore a plain wool coat, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that sleep could not touch. "It is done," Elias said quietly. "Is it?" Lydia asked. She turned her gaze to the street. The town of Jericho Creek was still there. The building still stood, but the air had changed. People walked quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. The revelation of Vane's corruption and the brutality of the night raid had shattered the illusion of order. The respectable families who had turned a blind eye now had to live with the knowledge of what they had permitted. Reverend Caldwell had locked the church doors. He had not been arrested. There was no law against hypocrisy. But his congregation had evaporated. The Sunday silence was his judgment. "Let us go home," Elias said. Home was a word that stuck in his throat. When they rode back into the ranch yard, the devastation was not something they could look away from. The main house still stood, but it was scarred. Bullet holes pockmarked the logs like borers. The windows were boarded up with rough planks. The blackened remains of the hay shed were a scar on the land, smelling of wet ash and loss. But the true cost lay under the cottonwood tree on the hill. They dismounted and walked to the fresh mound of earth. Gideon was already there, leaning on a crutch, his broken arm in a sling. He had carved a marker from a piece of fence post. It read simply, "Sims, 1868 to 1887. He stayed." Lydia sank to her knees in the dead grass. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She reached out and touched the rough wood. "He was 19, she whispered. "He liked to play the harmonica because he said the cows liked the music." "He was a good man," Gideon rasped, his voice thick. "Better than most." Elias put his hand on Lydia's shoulder. The weight of the boy's death pressed down on him. This was the price of the town's madness. Vane would sit in a cell, and Coburn would break rocks, but Sims would never see another sunrise. "We cannot stay in the house," Elias said, looking at the bullet-riddled structure. Not yet. It feels haunted. Where do we go? Gideon asked. Winter is coming on hard. Boss, the high pasture, Elias said, looking toward the mountains. The line cabin in the box canyon. It is small, but the roof is tight, and the air is cleaner up there. Lydia stood up. She wiped the dirt from her hands. She looked at the valley, at the fences that needed mending, at the town in the distance that was rotting from the inside out. Yes, she said. Let us go up. The move took 3 days. They drove the remaining cattle up the winding trail to the high country, a sheltered valley ringed by granite walls where the wind could not reach them. The cabin was little more than a shack, built of rough logs and stone, but it had a stove and a sturdy door. They settled into a rhythm of survival. Gideon took the bunk in the corner, tending to the fire and the cooking while his arm healed. Elias and Lydia took the loft. The isolation was a balm. Here, there were no staring eyes, no whispers. There was only the work. Chopping wood, breaking ice in the creek, keeping the calves alive. But the town of Jericho Creek did not vanish just because they had climbed above it. 2 weeks after the trial, Elias and Lydia had to go down for supplies. They could have ridden to the next county, but Lydia refused. I will not run, she had said. We have done nothing wrong. I will buy my flour in the town where I live. They walked into Holloway's general store. The windows were still cracked from the night the mob had beaten the shopkeeper. Mr. Holloway was there, wearing a patch over his left eye. He moved slowly, a shadow of the man he had been. When Lydia walked in, the store went silent. 2 women, Mrs. Gable and the baker's wife, were at the counter. They froze. Lydia walked past them. She did not lower her head. She did not apologize for her existence. She walked to the counter and placed her list on the wood. Good morning, Mr. Holloway, she said. Her voice was steady. Miss Lydia, Holloway said. He tried to smile, but it was a pained expression. I heard you were up in the high pasture. We are, Mrs. Gable turned. She looked at Lydia. Her lips pursed. She opened her mouth, likely to say something about decency or shame, the old habits rising like bile. Lydia turned and met her gaze. She didn't glare. She just looked at the woman with a profound, quiet clarity. She looked at Mrs. Gable's expensive bonnet and her nervous hands. The trial is over. Mrs. Gable, Lydia said softly. You know the truth. You can choose to hate me for surviving it, but I will not carry your shame for you anymore. Mrs. Gable's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She looked around the store, seeking support, but found none. The baker's wife looked at the floor. Mrs. Gable gathered her skirts and marched out, the bell above the door jangling harshly. It was not a victory parade. It was a quiet reclaiming of space. But as they loaded the wagon, they saw the decay. The hotel was empty. A family was loading a wagon down the street, moving out. Travelers had heard the stories of a town that burned its own, a town ruled by a corrupt baron and a violent mob. They bypassed Jericho Creek now. The gold that Vane had brought in was gone, and the town was left with its conscience. They are dying, Elias observed as they rode away. The town is dying. Let it die, Lydia said, looking forward. We have work to do. That night, the wind howled around the high cabin, but inside, the fire cast a warm, golden glow. Gideon was asleep, his snoring a rhythmic rumble from the corner. Elias and Lydia lay in the loft on a mattress filled with fresh straw and covered in buffalo robes. The heat from the stove rose to warm them. They were tired, their bodies aching from the day's labor. But sleep did not come immediately. Lydia turned to Elias in the dark. She traced the line of the scar on his arm where the bullet had grazed him. Does it hurt? She whispered. Only when it is cold, Elias said. And it is always cold. She smiled, a small ghost of a thing in the shadows. She moved closer, pressing her body against his side. Elias, she said. Thank you. For what? For not stopping, she said. When I begged you to, when I told you to let me go. Elias turned on his side to face her. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. His hand was rough, calloused, and scarred, but his touch was light as a breath. "I could not stop," he said. "It would have been like stopping my own heart." The intimacy that followed was not the desperate, frantic collision of the night of the siege. It was slow. It was quiet. It was the intimacy of two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side with their skin still smoking. They touched each other with a kind of reverence. Elias kissed the hollow of her throat, his hands moving over her back, feeling the strength in her muscles. Lydia held him, her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him close not for protection, but for connection. There was grief in it. Yes, they mourned Sims. They mourned the years they had both lost to loneliness and fear. But there was also life. Desire rose up, stubborn and green as new grass after a burn. "I am here," Lydia whispered against his lips. "I am whole." "You are everything," Elias murmured. They came together in the dark loft, the wind battering the roof, reclaiming the right to feel joy without permission. It was an act of defiance against a world that had wanted them dead or broken. Winter passed slowly. The snow piled deep in the pass, cutting them off from the world below. They were an island, but as the spring melt began, bringing the sound of rushing water to the canyon, a reminder arrived that the world was not entirely fixed. Gideon had gone down to check the lower fences. He returned with a face carved from stone. "Boss," Gideon said, sitting heavily on the bench outside the cabin. "I saw tracks near the south ridge. An unshod horse." Elias looked up from the axe he was sharpening. "Deke?" "Likely," Gideon said. "He was never caught. The marshal said he vanished into the Badlands." Elias looked at the ridge. The sky was a piercing blue, innocent and vast. "He is watching," Elias said. "He won't come in." Gideon said, "Not alone." "He is a coward without Vane to back him." "Maybe," Elias said. "But he is out there." Lydia came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the look on their faces. She looked at the ridge. "He is a ghost," she said firmly. "Let him haunt the Badlands. If he crosses the line, we will be ready. But I will not live looking over my shoulder. Elias, I am done with that." Elias looked at her. Her face was brown from the sun and wind. There were new lines around her eyes, etched by the hard winter. She looked stronger than he had ever seen her. She looked like the land itself, enduring. "You are right," Elias said. He stood up. "Let him watch. He will see nothing but us living." Summer came to the high country in a rush of wildflowers, paintbrush and lupine splashing color across the gray rock. They decided not to move back to the main house. They sold the lower section of the ranch, the part with the blood-stained house and the bad memories, to a group of settlers from the east who didn't know the history and didn't care. The money paid off the legal debts and bought lumber. They expanded the high cabin, adding a room, fixing the roof with cedar shakes, building a proper corral for the horses. It was a harder life up there. The air was thin. The winters would be brutal, and the road to town was long. But it was theirs. It was a place where the fences were for keeping cattle in, not for keeping the world out. One morning in late August, Elias woke early. The sun was just crowning the peaks, turning the sky a brilliant, hard gold. The air was crisp, smelling of pine resin and coffee. He walked out onto the new porch he had finished yesterday. He leaned against the railing, watching the horses breathe in the morning cold, their breath pluming in the light. The door opened behind him. Lydia stepped out. She was wearing a new dress she had sewn herself, a blue that matched the shadow of the mountains. She held 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him. "It is cold this morning," she said. "First frost is coming," Elias said. Lydia took a sip of her coffee. She looked out at the valley, at the herd grazing on the yellow grass, at the smoke rising from their chimney. Then she laughed. It was a soft sound, startled out of her by the sheer beauty of the morning. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't a laugh of relief. It was just a laugh. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She didn't check to see if she had permission to be happy. Elias watched her. He saw the way the light caught the stray hairs escaping her braid. He saw the peace in her shoulders. And in that moment, the realization hit him with the force of a revelation. For months. The town had called his protection of her the forbidden thing. They had called it sin. They had called it lust. They had called it weakness. But as he watched her laugh at the sunrise, Elias understood. The forbidden thing wasn't sex. It wasn't defying the social order. The forbidden thing was devotion, in a place as hard as this, in a town that demanded cruelty as a proof of strength, simply loving someone enough to bleed for them, without asking for anything in return, without treating them as property, was the most dangerous rebellion of all. He had rebelled, and he had won. "What are you looking at?" Lydia asked, catching him staring. Elias smiled, a rare, true smile that reached his eyes. "Just the view," he said. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm against her warm skin. She squeezed back, her fingers interlocking with his. They stood there on the porch of the home they had built from the wreckage, watching the sun climb higher into the wide western sky. The land before them was endless, indifferent, and beautiful. They were wary. Yes, they carried scars that would ache when the rain came. But as the wind swept down from the peaks, carrying the scent of snow and sage, they faced it together. They were no longer alone. Author's note: thank you, truly, for riding along with me on this journey through the dust and redemption of "Please stop doing that forbidden thing," she cried. It has been a privilege to tell the story of Elias and Lydia, a story not just about the Wild West, but about the resilience of the human heart in the face of judgment. I would love to know where you are listening or reading from today. Are you in the high plains yourself, or somewhere across the ocean? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did justice find its way? Or is the cost too high? If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of grit, love, and the American frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. There are many more stories waiting to be told in the shadow of the mesas. Until next time, keep your fences mended and your powder dry.